There was an old saying among those who sailed the void: those who pry at the seams of creation will find the darkness staring back. I thought of it as I stood at the observation rail of the survey ship Arion, the hull around my boots humming with the kind of tension that turned steel into thought. We were 2 light-years out from the last inhabited relay, the stars outside like pins driven into cloth, and yet something in the dark had the shape of a wound. Command had not asked, command had ordered. Investigate Orion's forbidden dimension, contain or neutralize at will, the message had said in clipped bureaucracy. I was captain at that moment, and also the single human conscience between a dozen crew and an unknown that did not obey the laws we had memorized. I felt the obligation like a weight and a promise at once. If we failed, no record might remain to tell what we had seen. Stay with me, and I will show you what shapes a mind when the lattice of space begins to whisper. We were given 3 hours to prepare, and 2 hours to formulate a plan. In the briefing room, light meters clicked, and the air smelled faintly of ozone and burnt coffee. The console panels sent out a low, steady percussion that felt like a second pulse beneath my own. Lieutenant Mira Cade leaned over the schematics, fingers tracing lines she had memorized before she could sleep. Commander Havel did not look up from his datapad. Dr. Elias Rourke opened a bag of synth biscuits and closed it without eating. Sergeant Anna Voss tightened her glove and tapped the mag bootstrap until it clicked. Juno Park adjusted the sensor array on the table. I issued the order, and I heard it echoed back until it became a rhythm. This was what I was paid for and what I feared. A lattice had opened in a place marked taboo on every atlas I had ever seen. The forbidden dimension was not a place on a map. It was a folding of rules into an angle our physics did not predict. "Captain," Havel said, "you know the brief. We cannot bring the fleet into that field without risking cascade collapse." "I know," I replied. "We go with the Arion only. Probe, scan, seal if possible. Evacuate civilians in a 3 light-year radius if necessary." "This was meant to be sealed by the old observatories," Mira said, eyes raw. "Warnings are inert unless someone acts," I said. "It may speak to us," Elias said. "Be careful about listening." "What does that even mean?" Anna asked. "It means it might learn how to convince us that it is safe," Elias answered. We fitted ourselves with suits, sensor packs, and containment charges. The ship tasted like grease and polished polymer under the fluorescence. Outside, the void had the cold that felt like glass. The first approach to the aperture showed it like a bruise on space, a blackness that did not reflect light but seemed to absorb the idea of light itself. Our instruments produced numbers, then contradictions, then loops that smiled back at us. The probe tapes jittered and produced a note, a harmonic that felt like nails on a retina. I authorized a short-range approach, and the viewport filled with textures I had no language for. There were strands of matter like gelatin and plates like bones grown from some slow tidal logic. The anomalia breathed with a low, sibilant hiss that we began to call a whisper. When we crossed the threshold, the air in the command deck went thin by measure and not by physiology. Sensors recorded a pressure that wanted to be negative and a gravity vector that flirted with sidewaysness. The Arion shivered, hull plate setting up a counter-rhythm. At first, the voices were a rumor, circuitry and mimetic echoes that rolled over the crew like a tide. Petty Officer Juno Park shouted at a readout and then went quiet, head bowed, hands pressed to ears. Juno was never dramatic. She was 19 and precise. Dr. Rourke placed a palm on the sensor cluster as if to feel the music with his skin. He said later that the waveform felt like memory prisms striking each other. "Do you read anything coherent?" I asked. "Only interference and a pattern that repeats every 83 seconds, said Chief Engineer Rika. "It is not noise in a way we understand." "It is learning our code," Elias murmured. "Containment charges are armed," Anna said. "We have a tactical team ready." "Hold," I said. "We will not be the first to step in blind." We debated for hours, or at least long enough for fatigue to thin our resolve. The aperture pulsed like a heartbeat, and every time it pulsed, the sound of a bell threaded through the ship in a frequency below hearing. It set teeth on edge and memory on fire. The command chain frayed when individuals heard promises in the whisper. Some wanted to take a sample at any cost. Others wanted to retreat and report. The orders from above were a flat line that said contain and classify. I found myself arguing for measured risk, for the duty to know. But duty is not a shield against curiosity, and the crew is a bundle of souls, not a machine. We sent the first field team out on magline suits into the vicinity of the lattice. Mira led the pack, Rika trailing with a tether, Anna in the center with the charges. The surface of the forbidden geometry was like cooled glass and wet bark at the same time. It squealed softly when our gloves brushed it. I watched from the viewport as their silhouettes grew small against something that was both horizon and predator. The exterior was cold to the touch and smelled faintly of iron and seaweed. The light that leaked from the lattice was not light as we understood it. It painted our faces with an absence and moved across skin like a slow tide. I felt my knees go weak. The first contact changed everything. A strand like a filament reached out and touched Rika's gloved hand. Her breath hissed, and the console announced a spike in neuroprobe readings. Rika looked toward the ship and smiled as though she had been told a joke she could not share. "It tastes like growing," she said to no one we could see. "It tastes of second chances." Juno wrote in her log after she left, a line that would later be quoted by committees. None of us were prepared for the way the forbidden dimension learned to speak with names. It did not use words as our tongues do. It used the rhythm of our heartbeats, the echo of regret held long enough, the smell of home in a single breath. It found us in the gaps. Orders held for a time until someone heard in the whisper the precise memory they had tried to bury. The effect was not uniform. Some laughed, some sobbed, others went to the observation rail and stared until skin paled. At 1/3 into our mission, I will pause and ask you something directly. I know you have questions. If you were the one with authority to withdraw the Arion or to stay and risk the cascade, what would you do? If you would retreat, say, I would recede. If you would risk everything to learn, say, I would push forward. Tell us in the comments. Your answer matters to stories like this because it reveals how you weigh curiosity against lives. People here debated for hours, sometimes in whispers, sometimes with the bluntness of orders. Your voice may be the mirror some captain needs to see through the fog. Back on the deck, the fracture in command became a fracture in belief. Dr. Elias Rourke argued for experimentation, for a slow incision into the lattice to see if intelligence lay within. We owe it to science, he said, fingers glued to the data slate. We may be interacting with an organism, possibly a mind older than our reckoning. To walk away is to commit an epistemic sin. Commander Havel answered with the cold calculus of command. We owe the lives aboard this vessel and the stability of the sector more than we owe a curiosity that could kill billions. Sergeant Anna Voss did not speak in the abstract. She spoke of the men she had watched die on cold moons when orders failed. I can count on my hands the times we got a second chance, she said. We do what keeps the numbers alive. Juno Park, quiet at first, said simply, we are not gods. Petty Officer Thom, the communications specialist, said, whatever it is changing how we hear each other. Specialist Thom was a sentinel of small comforts, and he would later carve a small wooden token that he kept in his pocket during the last hours. The backstory I carried was a set of loose seams that explained my choices but did not excuse them. I was born on a station that orbited a dying gas giant, the kind of place where your childhood is measured in the cadence of maintenance schedules. My mother taught shipboard hygiene and sang lullabies about stars that did not return your glance. My father was a navigator who taught me how to listen to silence, because silence was often the only safe signal. When the blockade came and our sector's relay fell, I watched neighbors load into lifeboats that never found their numbers again. I promised quietly then that I would not let indecision kill people under my watch. That promise hardened into orders. After the academy, I served on a slate of frigates and learned how to read a command as if it were scripture. I lost a squadron to a radiation storm that the charts failed to predict, and I learned the cost of trusting instruments alone. I once ordered a retreat to save 25 lives, only to be court-martialed for leaving behind an engineer who would have fixed the reactor on the front line. That engineer died anyway. The memory of his face is a quiet excoriation I carry. These histories made me the kind of captain who would debate until breath gave out, rather than make a gamble on faith. They made me practical and afraid in equal measure. When the lattice whispered my name, it called up the smell of solder in a childhood workshop and the taste of rain we never had. I had reasons to be stern and reasons to be tender. They pushed in opposite directions until I no longer knew which was order and which was need. We named people and watched them act. Miracade mapped the lattice edges and lost and found her composure in cycles, each time returning with new observations. Commander Havel held the loop of chain of command and reduced it to simple arithmetic when panic wanted to add letters. Dr. Elias Rook pursued hypotheses like a man chasing a lost lover. Sergeant Anna Voss carried explosives and courage in equal measure. Juno Park kept logs and small confidences. Chief Engineer Rika hummed repairs and secrets to the hull. Petty Officer Tham guarded communication and pocketed trinkets that could not be catalogued. Specialist Solon, who commanded the unmanned drones, became the nervous eye that watched the lattice while the rest of us slept. Each of them acted in particular ways that would etch the later pages of the record. On the 4th day of exposure, the lattice learned to mimic voices exactly. It began to braid with memory and to present possibilities as if they were facts. The ship's power grid flickered, and a black bloom of inky filaments grew from a crack in the outer hull where micrometeorites had grazed us. It was as if the forbidden dimension wanted a foothold. Our first front of conflict occurred when a drone Solon had sent to sample the perimeter did not return. He and his team watched the feed and saw the drone drop and then rise, altered. The image showed an outer shell that bent space in the track of the propulsor, and then a bloom of fibrous matter that attached to the drone like barnacles. The drone started to transmit voices recorded from the crew. We heard our own words back to us with a delay that suggested intelligence. I authorized a recovery which turned into a skirmish when the lattice manifested a projectile that moved like a slow, deliberate needle. "Take cover," Anna shouted. "Bring the charges online." "Cover now," I commanded. "Solon, bring her home." "She is not responding," Solon said. "She is sending images of home. Her mother is calling her." "Then cut the feed," Havel ordered. "Cannot," Thom said. "The signal is modulated with our own protocols. It knows us." The first attack was not like a battle you could count with ordnance and casualties. It was a baited moral trap. The projectile pierced the hull of one pod, and a smell of wet earth filled the corridor for a moment, as if someone had opened a window to a childhood garden. People cried and reached toward the scent. We lost a scientist who stepped out to touch what she thought was soil and then vanished along with her suit. Her last words, captured in static, were a name none of us recognized, and the sound of laughter that was not her own. We had to make a technical plan to close the aperture. The ship could not simply detonate the lattice without risking a reaction that might tear the fabric of local space. Dr. Rourke proposed a method of stiffening the local manifold using phased resonance to force the lattice into a collapse that would be contained within a generated mesh. Rika argued for a slower burn, seeding the lattice with a synthetic membrane that would allow containment without abrupt energy release. Havel wanted the charges put in place and detonated in sequence if any attempt at negotiation failed. The options were math and risk. Each plan required an external team to place nodes in precise vectors around the aperture. That meant a second exposure. We formed a vanguard sortie. The atmosphere on deck was metallic and sharp. The suits tasted of recycled air and adrenaline. We argued while we moved, words short and tight to keep the rhythm of the mission. Mira and Rika wired the first node with hands that did not stop shaking. Anna saw ghosts in the filament patterns and tightened her jaw. Juno recited checklists over the comms like prayers. Elias recorded everything, whispering hypotheses between breaths. The lattice shifted when we approached, an act of attention or a predatory breath. The first node clicked into place, and the instrument readings spiked. The lattice responded not with physical force, but with temptation. It presented a scene in which the past returned. Commander Havel saw his sister alive, calling from a shore he had not touched in decades. He did not move at first. I grabbed his arm and felt his pulse like a drum gone soft. We reached the technical moment known afterwards simply as the choice. The plan to stiffen the manifold required someone to braid their consciousness into the resonance field long enough to tune the phase. It was a form of mental welding with a cost. The person on the interface would experience the lattice as a sequence of possible lives, and would be vulnerable to the whisper. The field would be stable only if the operator could resist the temptation to step into one of those lives. Rika and Elias both volunteered. Mira refused to let either go alone. I volunteered because I had a duty and a debt and a memory that demanded penance. Those hours were raw and intimate, a calculus of fear braided with stubbornness. Moment of tension 1. The interface hummed, and my mind went bright with 1,000 doors. I saw a version of myself who had never joined the fleet, who had stayed in a port and raised a child that lived under a roof of honest wood. The image smelled of tea and new rain. The lattice leaned like gravity and offered the warmth for a price. I felt my hand on the console as if it were a promise to someone I once loved. For a full minute the temptation was a lever and my will a thin plank. I could have stepped into it without anyone noticing and saved myself a lifetime of regret. Instead, I breathed, counted the rhythm of the ship, and pushed. The field locked, for a time, like a throat closing around a memory. Moment of tension 2. Elias sang in another language that I did not know while he fed the phase with a cadence of numbers. Each syllable rewrote the way the lattice pronounced our names. The air tasted of copper and lemon peel. He started to smile in a way that meant some hallucination had taken hold. Mira reached across and slapped his hand. "Do you remember who you are?" she demanded. He did not answer immediately. For a near infinite fraction of an instant, we were all silent, and she found his eyes and said, "Remember the oath." He clenched his jaw and resumed. The field shuddered, and the amplitude dropped by a margin that felt like salvation. Moment of tension 3. Rika wrote her name on the hull in grease and asked me to promise something I could not give. She wanted the assurance that her life would be counted if she stayed, and that her children would be safe. I had no authority to guarantee such personal deaths, and my voice failed. She hung the final node like a charm, and the lattice focused on her like a scholar reading the margins. For a long beat she saw a life where she had been a potter who shaped jars with slow hands. The filament wrapped her glove, and she whispered, "It remembers making things." Then she tore it free and turned back to the crew. The node pulsed and the network stabilized. Each moment above had weight, measured in breaths and in the sound the ship made when confronted with the possible. The final procedure was brutal in its simplicity. We initiated the phased resonance and fed it with the lock code Elias had engineered. The lattice trembled and shrieked in frequencies we recorded and would later not publish. For a while it was as if the ship existed inside a bell, and the bell was being struck from within. The lattice contracted and then cracked, like ice breaking along an old seam.
Filaments withdrew, and the blackness thinned to a dull bruise. We sealed the lattice behind a synthetic membrane Rika had prepared, and anchored the nodes into a ring that the Arion kept in a slung orbit like a necklace. The cost was immediate and heavy. 5 souls did not return. A dozen more carried new names in their mouths, given by the whisper. Commander Havel left the bridge for good and took a shuttle to a region where he had seen his lost shore. He would not come back. Rika had permanent scars along her wrist where the filaments had left a pattern. Elias recorded his logs until his voice broke and then asked to be left alone. Juno Park kept a diary that would become an artifact locked in the archives. The ship itself had a scar along the hull where the lattice had grazed her paint like a claw. We had stopped something that might have become a contagion, and we had fed it with our curiosity. The record called it containment. To many, it was a success. To some, I had called it mercy. The sacrifice that followed the sealing was not simply a matter of bodies. I remained on the interface long enough to hear the lattice articulate one sentence in a voice that stitched together all our names. It said, "Thank you for letting me remember." That sound lodged in my chest and turned tenderness into guilt. Had we cured something or given memory a prison? The command logs would later draw clean lines and write recommendations in sterile prose. They would recommend beacons, quarantines, and new protocols. They would laud tenacity and warn of seduction. The committees would convene and reframe myth. I would be mentioned politely, and my decisions would be parsed as necessary. The epilogue unfolded in time like sediment. 1 month later, the Arion limped into a holding bay where legal teams came aboard with paper smiles. Families met at a safe distance and worked through grief with checklists.
We held a minor memorial with potted relatives and a reading of names. A handful of scientists petitioned for additional study of the sealed membrane. I refused an interview that would have turned agony into a soundbite. The survivors walked with their hands around small objects they had kept in pockets to remind them that their lives had weight. The sector issued advisories, and the word lattice entered technical manuals and became a term used with boredom at conferences. 3 months later, the membrane was catalogued in a classified archive, and a team of bureaucrats wrote contingencies while a clandestine corporation tried to purchase the design. Community centers and orbital settlements posted memorials for the lost, and children played near the sculptures made of detritus from the Arion. There were rumors that a cult had formed that called the lattice an oracle, and that saints of curiosity came to pray at a model of the ring. I walked through a corridor once and saw a scrap of filament used as jewelry on a market stand, and I felt like a seam in a garment had been ripped free. The world had adapted by folding the event into its habit. 6 months after the sealing, I found a note in my locker written in a hand I did not recognize. It said, simply, "You kept us a little longer." It was an odd kindness. I also received a report that a distant colony had altered its curriculum to teach children to listen for silence as a navigation skill. They had taken the terror and turned it into training. Some called it survivalism, others called it resilience. I met with survivors in a small group, and we traded stories like contraband. We argued about whether knowledge gained from that forbidden dimension was worth the cost. I did not offer an answer. I sat with them and let the air taste like old solder and rain, and let the memory of names move through me. I would not claim heroism. I would claim responsibility. There was no applause, only a ledger and a quiet that sat in the bones. The lattice left us altered. It left artifacts and questions and a scar on the map that was both warning and invitation. If you imagine a future where human curiosity remains a lamp that sometimes sets houses alight, then you know what we chose. We chose to close the door, even as we listened to the music behind it. We chose containment and cost. We chose to be the clause in history that kept something from unweaving further. If you were in my place, would you have done the same? Would you have sealed the memory, or allowed it to grow into a thing that might have offered salvation at the price of losing what it means to be human? I cannot answer for you. I can only tell you that the Arians survived because a handful of us decided that some mysteries are best held in a ring of watchful wood and wire. We are left with the artifacts, the memos, and the small children who make toys from fragments of filament. We are left with committees and euphemisms. We are left with the quiet. In the month that followed, I walked the markets and saw people wearing necklaces made of lattice shards and calling them talismans of resilience. I read reports where the sealed membrane was listed as evidence of possible life forms that manipulate memory as defense. I visited Rika in a rehabilitation unit, and she showed me a small pot she had made with hands that trembled less than before. She said, "We did not save the world today. We kept it from being renamed in a foreign tongue." That was her way of framing sacrifice. Elias sent me a final log that ended with an apology to a planet he had never served. Commander Havel never returned, and some nights I still imagine him on a shore I do not know. If you came here for a clean ending, I cannot provide that. The lattice sits in a classified repository, rings scratched with study notes, its surface a lesson in humility. The Arion sails again, though she carries the memory of that wound in her hull. I carry the decision in my bones, and in my sleep, where sometimes the whisper calls my childhood name and offers a window I will not step through. The moral, if there is one, is that duty is an act of choosing among terrible options. We chose so others might have options at all. If you stayed until the end and feel the pull of these questions, subscribe and follow. These stories are not just fiction. They are mirrors of decisions we will be called to make in the quiet assemblies of tomorrow. Share what you would have done. Did you recede or did you push forward? Tell us in the comments, starting with "I would recede" or "I would push forward." Your voice shapes what we imagine, and the next captain might read your words when they face a lattice of their own. For now, the Arion drifts on, and the stars remain stitched in their places. We are a small scar on the face of space. We look up and choose to remember what we saw and what we lost.